To maximize the space available for standard cell placement and to avoid routing congestion problems, here are the guidelines for placing macros in the floor plan. When creating the initial floor plan, these macro placement guidelines will help you to maximize the space available for standard cell placement and avoid routing congestion problems. The first guideline is that we should place macros around the chip periphery. Always consider connections to fixed cells when placing macros. Change the orientation of the macros accordingly to minimize the distance between pins. Reserve enough room around macros. We should reduce open fields as much as possible to maximize the random logic area. You should also consider constraints, such as timing for your design, power, IP-specific restriction, and DFT test. First guideline we will discuss is to place the macros around the chip periphery. Placing a macro inside the core can invite serious consequences during routing due to a lot of detour routing. This is because macros are equal to a significant obstacle for routing. As we can see in the picture, that placing macros inside the core is taking a lot of detour routing, which is not a preferable practice. Placing the hard macros around the core periphery makes it easier to supply power to them and reduces the chance of IR drop problems for macros consuming high amounts of power. The second guidelines is to consider connections to fixed cells. When placing macros, when you decide on the macro position, you must consider connections to fixed elements such as I/O and pre-placed macros. Place macros near the corresponding associate fixed elements and check connections by displaying flight lines in the Innovis GUI. The third guideline is to change the orientation of the macros accordingly to minimize the distance between pins. When you decide the orientation of macros, keep the macros orientation according to the I/O pins positions and the respective connections to the macros. As we can see in the picture, that the orientation of the macros has been changed to minimize the distance between pins. The fourth guideline is to reserve enough room around macros for regular net routing and power grid. You have to reserve enough routing space around macros to avoid congestion issues in routing stage, as you can see in the picture. The final guideline is to reduce open fields as much as possible to increase the random logic area. Eliminate dead space, except for reserved routing resources, to maximize random logic area. Consider adjusting aspect ratio to reduce open fields.